Now, today's event is called Inequality, Past and Present, and it's a roundtable discussion of The Dawn of Everything, a New History of Humanity, a book co-authored by the late anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow, who joins us today. Now, as a testimony to the great interest here at Harvard in discussion about your work, Professor Wengrow, today's event has attracted no fewer than 10 co-sponsors, and it is my great pleasure to thank them all here, which I will do. And so it's the Inequality in America Initiative, the Mahindra Humanities Center, the Standing Committee on Archaeology, Science of the Human Past, the Max Planck Harvard Research Center for the Archaeoscience of the Ancient Mediterranean, the GSAS, or the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences workshop on the history and archaeology of the ancient Near East, Ancient Studies, the Department of History, the Department of Anthropology, and the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilization. And on behalf of all of the sponsors, I especially wish to thank Dan Smale and Rowan Flad for designing this event. It's been absolutely wonderful working with both of you throughout the planning for today. So thank you, a warm thank you for that. And now it is my great pleasure to hand things over to Larry Bobo. Larry Bobo is the Dean of Social Science and the W.E.B. Du Bois Professor of the Social Sciences, and he also holds an appointment in the Department of African and African American Studies. So my honor to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susie, and welcome to all of you this afternoon for what really should be a remarkably rich and stimulating session today, we could say, at the dawn of the semester as we discuss the dawn of everything. On behalf of the Division of Social Science and the Inequality in America Initiative, I want to say we were really excited to, when I think Dan first reached out to us to help support this very interesting symposium. For those of you who don't know, the IAI is a multidisciplinary effort to elevate and energize teaching and research on social and economic inequality, and to use what we learn to inform public debate, and indeed to shape public responses to these challenges. And it's had an interesting life since it started in 2018. We've now had three, I think, highly successful cohorts of postdocs. So we've got 6 alums out there in the world of the program. We actually have 8 postdocs in residence now, including one on this panel here with us, who I assume will be introduced to you all shortly. And it has been a truly interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary collection with young PhDs in economics, sociology, history, psychology, political science, and anthropology filling out the ranks of our postdoc program. And a great number of grants have been made to our faculty to support their research activities again, and it covers that full field, that full spectrum of fields. I will say, however, that the Inequality in America program has a very contemporary and in some respects arguably presentist approach to most of what it does. We don't look terribly far back. And so part of what is fascinating to me and intellectually really engaging here is this question of just how baked into what it is human beings do is the problem of inequality, especially when we get to living in large collectivities with one another. So I really look forward to the opportunity to unpack the ideas that David Wengrow and his colleagues have put before us here. My particular duty here right now is to introduce my colleague and friend, Rowan Flad, who was one of the key organizers of this effort. He is the John Hudson Professor of Archaeology in our Department of Anthropology here at Harvard. He has also served as the Archaeology Program Director and as Department Chair here of Anthropology. His own research focuses on the emergence and development of complex society during the Neolithic period and the Bronze Age in China. This work incorporates interests in diachronic change in production processes and technology, the intersection between ritual activity and production, the role of animals in early Chinese society, particularly their sacrifice and divination, and the processes involved in social change in general. And he's published quite extensively and received numerous honors befitting a remarkable scholar of Rowan stature. So without further ado, because Dan is looking at me like my 3 minutes have been exhausted, I'm going to turn it over to Rowan Flad. But thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dean Bobo, and thank you all for coming today. It's really a pleasure to have this event convened in person and to have so many of you with us. I'm afraid I'm going to go over my allotted 5 minutes, so I'll just get right to my comments and welcome you all to this exciting event. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to say a few words of introduction to the event generally and to the speakers before yielding the floor to our roundtable discussants for what you're actually here to hear. In a distinguished lecture in 2010, convening the 109th meeting of the American Anthropological Association in New Orleans, Louisiana, Jeremy Sabloff, a Harvard graduate who went on to a prestigious career at the University of Pennsylvania, made a plea to the practitioners of our multifaceted discipline of anthropology to follow the model of Margaret Mead, a towering figure in anthropology and a visible public presence who was widely known in the 1960s and 1970s. Sabloff called on us to make accessible the ideas central to our discipline, to strengthen public outreach, and generally find ways to make our knowledge, insights, and voices heard. Through the book at the center of today's discussion, which I'll lift up here, The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity, and associated op-eds and excerpts in the New York Times and The Guardian and Sapiens and numerous other places, as well as laudatory and sometimes critical reviews in a whole host of venues, such as the Atlantic and the New York Review of Books, Science, Art Forum, and so on and so forth. The anthropologist David Graeber and the archaeologist David Wengrow have certainly taken up this challenge. For decades, anthropologists and archaeologists have been content to shake our fists and raise our voices in response to public-facing grand narratives about human history penned by ornithologists like Jared Diamond or historians like Yuval Noah Harari. Now we can shake our fists and raise our voices to representatives of our own disciplines. And it's clearly not only social anthropologists and archaeologists who have something to say in response to the stimulating and provocative revisions, reformulations, and proposed frameworks that the book raises. The impact of the work ranges from political philosophy to economics to comparative history and beyond. And today, we are delighted to have a range of scholars who will stimulate discussion about this new human history. Without further ado, I present to you our panelists. We have arranged the speakers alphabetically in the order in which they were presenting, from left to right, which conveniently ends up with Wengrow at the end. And it is in that order that I will introduce them briefly before they commence their remarks. Sue Alcock is the Barnett Family Professor of Classical Archaeology at the University of Oklahoma, where she recently moved after previous positions in classical studies at the University of Michigan, as the inaugural director of the Gojko Institute of Archaeology and the Ancient World at Brown University, and most recently as the interim provost of the University of Michigan, Dearborn. Her scholarship is wide-ranging, with widely influential monographs on the archaeology of landscape in Roman Greece, archaeological approaches to monuments and memory, and the provincial boundaries of ancient Rome. And she was also a pioneer in massive online open content courses that exposed thousands of literally thousands of interesting people at a time around the world to cutting-edge ideas that emerged from archaeological work. We are delighted to have her here with us again to join our community today. Gojko Barjamovic is senior lecturer in Assyriology and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations here at Harvard, where he has served on the faculty since 2013. His research also covers the study of early state power and international relations and explores the functioning of royal courts, diplomacy, and local institutions of governance, particularly in the context of Assyria during the 2nd and 1st millennia BC. This semester, he is teaching a freshman seminar on the beginnings of business, in which he and his students are wrestling with the challenges posed in the Graeber and Wengrow volume, among other things. And we had Professor Wengrow joined that course the other day. Phil Deloria is the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History in the Departments of History and American Studies here at Harvard. His research and teaching focus on the social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States, as well as the interconnections among indigenous peoples in a global context. His publications examine Native American experiences and the co-option of Native tropes in American society, as well as a recent comprehensive treatment of the field of American studies. Asia Lanz is a postdoctoral fellow in the Inequality in America initiative, about which you just heard from Dean Bobo. She completed her PhD in anthropology at Syracuse University in 2021, where she concentrated on historical archaeology, cultural heritage preservation, structural violence, and the critical study of bioarchaeological research, particularly related to historical narratives surrounding museum collections that include the remains of Black bodies. Among other accomplishments, she recently received a grant from the Wengrow Foundation to conduct research on the remains of Black individuals held in the Harvard collection. And our last panelist is David Wengrow, Professor of Comparative Archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology of the University College London. His research interests are wide-ranging, as reflected in the copious scope of the book that is the focus of today's discussion, with a particular emphasis on early state formation and prehistoric art and aesthetics in the Eastern Mediterranean. Trained at Oxford from his undergraduate through his PhD, he joined the UCL faculty in 2004, where he has produced several outstanding books with increasingly provocative titles, from The Archaeology of Early Egypt, maybe not as provocative, to What Makes Civilization, the Ancient Near East and the Future of the West, to The Origins of Monsters, Image and Cognition in the First Age of Mechanical Reproduction, to the book that we are discussing today. In addition to all this public-facing articles and dialogues that I mentioned earlier, he is also an active presence on Twitter, where he has nearly 25,000 followers, which I compared to a bunch of other people in our field, and is quite above many others. And he will round out the roundtable today. Finally, I will say a few words about the chief faculty organizer of today's event, Professor Dan Smale, who will act as our moderator in the Q&A. Dan is the Frank B. Baird Jr. Professor of History here at Harvard, and works on the history and anthropology of Mediterranean societies between 1100 and 1600, and on deep human history, a topic about he is currently co-teaching a gen ed course along with Professor Matthew Liebman, who's in the back, which Dr. Wengrow joined yesterday. Among his many publications are books on legal culture and material possessions in Marseille, households and debt collection in medieval Europe, and on deep history. His drive and organization has been instrumental to making this happen today, and he was immensely enhanced by the expert administrative support from Mary McKinnon of the Mahendra Humanities Center and Jennifer Shepard from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Of course, I will be remiss not to once again thank all the various departments and institutes and initiatives across Harvard who have provided various forms of logistical and financial support for today's event. And with that, I turn over the mic to Professor Alcock for our first comments.
One of the more, at first, disconcerting traits of the dawn of everything is its frequent chapter divisions, headed by statements of in the sort of "in which we" variety, some 82 over 12 chapters, in which we enter something of an academic no-go zone and discuss the possibility of Neolithic matriarchies, or in which we dispose of one particularly silly argument about foragers. At first, I will admit, I found this somewhat off-putting. It took me back to English Lit, Gulliver's Travels, Vanity Fair, Tom Jones. And it all seemed a little peculiar, a little precious, certainly more than a little unexpected in a global bestseller that, quote, rivals fantasy epics in heft and imaginative scope. That's the WAPO. And, quote, the biggest book in archaeology since Indiana Jones escaped from the snake pit. Thus, The Guardian. But quite quickly, I got the point, or perhaps better, I got the joke. And that was, this is a book that does not feel constrained to mind its manners, that likes to ruffle, scuffle, and disobey. And in that, it models one of the principal, and to my mind, most important themes of the book, the qualities of imagination, creativity, experimentation, disobedient as they often are, are core to our human experience, and indeed are what indeed make us human in the first place, or for the authors, are what help to make us free. What I came to admire is the book's bedrock insistence that peoples of the long-distant past shared in these capabilities and capacities. Multiple quotes attest to this. Here's just one. We are projects of collective self-creation. What if we approached human history in that way? What if we treat people from the beginning as imaginative, intelligent, playful creatures who deserved to be understood as such? End quote. Now, some may wonder, why is this even necessary? Surely, to paraphrase Dr. Seuss, a person's a person, no matter how old. But as the authors make painfully clear, the academic tendency, which bleeds into what most people know from school, is to strip peoples of the past of such qualities, rendering them far less interesting, far less quirky, far less human. They become cardboard stereotypes, primordial human soup, sock puppets, a paleo lamb chop, and thereby, to the authors, making pre- and early history far more dull than is necessary, fair, or wise. I think it is far from an accident that the word play or playful recurs throughout the book. Now, any archaeologist reading The Dawn will have a kaleidoscope of reactions, perhaps a proud, yes, I too have rejected the sock puppet, or a wistful, I just wish they'd said more about X, or I agree with the mission and there are other ways to contribute moments. I at least had all three. First, on sock puppets. I'm a survey archaeologist, which means by and large I don't excavate, I don't work in cities. My material sphere, it tends to the rural, the non-monumental, the scrappy little bits and pieces lying on the ground. And with such limited data, it can indeed be perilously easy to fall into the trap that the authors so vigorously assail, that of assuming such ancient peoples didn't know much, do much, think much, change much, and certainly not play much. And that is inequality indeed. For reasons both personal and professional, I never bought such attitudes. Professionally, my focus on the Greek world under the Roman Empire raised innumerable questions of collective memory practices and remembrance under imperial rule. Questions that I refused to accept could be restricted to the elite or to the urban. And while far from proving an easy archaeological row to hoe, it beats by a mile drowning in primordial soup in the embrace of a sock puppet. And that leads to my I wish there had been more about X. The authors make much, rightly, of our need to appreciate the deeply long-term processes of creation and experimentation, often by women, that led to acquired understandings of domestication, craft production, ultimately leading to the development of properties of space, time, structure, of mathematical and geometrical knowledges. And they speak to the remarkable geographic spread of such ideas and outcomes. But how did such processes manifest themselves? How did they take place? Can we seek to better trace and articulate the memory work and generational transmission that the Dawn assumes to have taken place? I suspect such exploration would only add to the antic, playful quality of the past. At very least, it appears to me a valid next stage question. Now, it may seem churlish to whine for more, given the book's already Brobdingnagian scope. And as we all know, The Dawn of Everything was intended as an Act 1. Establish the protagonists, chew the scenery a bit, make some noise, and come to tighter resolutions, if never closure, down the road. As originally envisioned, that sadly won't be the case. But that makes it even more incumbent on those truly struck by the book, not just on the bandwagon, truly struck by the book, to take up the challenge posed by the authors to ask better questions. They suggest, for example, exploring the correlation of gender equality and social innovation. I've just made a modest proposal in a different direction, and no doubt other better questions are even now emerging to assess and to calibrate some of the claims that Dawn has made. As for my personal third reaction, I agree with the mission, and there are other ways to contribute. David Graeber memorably said, "It's time to change the course of history starting with the past. Now, perhaps, sadly, few of us could manage to be that swashbuckling, but it would be a feeble archaeologist indeed who did not conceive of their role as some kind of change agent in the classroom writ large, if not always in our writings. The authors are right to poke hard at the insularity of much of our professional academic discourse, the perplexing whys and unfortunate wherefores to which I hope we can pursue in our discussion. But through whatever media shared, the field of archaeology has some fundamental lessons it can impart. It is a field where you have very little of control over finding what you find, often destroying what you find as you go, a field where new discoveries will constantly and rightly overturn and invalidate a life's work, as indeed with some periodic asperity in the book. As such, well, it can teach one resilience and humility. As a field that of necessity is team-oriented and an ever-expanding team at that, especially with the explosion in archaeological sciences, it can teach the importance of cross-collaboration, dialogue, and non-hierarchical intellectual exchange. And given the field's ceaseless leitmotif of loss, change, impermanence, and death, in a world that embraces magical thinking and lionizes the spin, archaeology can offer some hard and elemental lessons about the human condition. If not epic interventions, such lessons can nevertheless make a difference in individual lives and for the long run. Now, do such lessons always work? Of course not. Nah, never. But that does not mean their advocacy should be abandoned. And the two Davids stand by their own stubborn optimisms, and so do I. I began with my perturbation over the dawn of everything's orotund chapter divisions. Let me quote you another one from Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, Book 9, Chapter 1. Of those who lawfully may, and of those who may not, write such histories as this. I am quite sure that our two authors would not take kindly to that lawfully may. So let's go with those who courageously and playfully did write such a history as this. Few could. In which we give thanks, feel sadness, and offer our respect to the one who carries on. Thank you.
That's a tough act to follow. The Dawn of Everything is a massive piece of work, staggeringly ambitious, encyclopedic in scope, rife with ideas, choosing to engage societal development in a trade book, really bold and exciting. There is so much to unpack, and with just 8 minutes to do it, I will do one deep dive and go into the chapter about political hierarchies in early cities. For those who haven't read the book, this may seem a trivial intervention, but there are important issues at stake. There has been and continues to be a line of thought which claims that the invention of democracy as an articulated form of governance should be historically placed in Europe, that a concept of freedom is absent from most political traditions otherwise, that slavery was a baseline that somehow freedom had to be taken out of. Democracy is central to the West's story of itself, and its origin myth gives direction and purpose. History comes with a start and a finish line. The Dawn rejects such views, presenting case studies of a multiplicity of political traditions from always and from everywhere, underlining this plurality and fluidity. By decentering such core concepts as popular rule and removing it from notions of cultural evolution, the book frees us to study each case presented as a unique instance, of course not independent of geopolitical surroundings, environmental constraints, or even global and local histories, but free from classification and evolutionary doctrine. A favored term is playful, as we also heard from Sue. Time and again, the authors emphasize the frivolous aspect of human interaction, a tendency to plan and experiment and stumble and compromise in perhaps roughly equal measure, though certainly not without intent or direction, but often with a touch of risk, as societies look for ways to make things work. This takes on particular importance in the case of Mesopotamia due to its tendency to loom large in conventional models of social evolution. First cities often get presented as archetypal structures, places of power and reinforcing of hierarchies. whether they're styled as patrimonial households, temple states, or hydraulic despotisms, their role as the original architects of power has been repeated over and over. The Dawn problematizes this notion, using the case of ancient Uruk to argue that executive power in the early cities of Mesopotamia was wielded by civic assemblies with extensive popular involvement. This idea goes back to an influential 1942 article by Torkel Jacobsen, who was a professor here back in the day, and who drew on evidence from epics and myths about divine assemblies to propose an original political order of parliamentary democracy, which later tradition relegated to the divine sphere. Authors acknowledge the idea has its problems, but keep the conclusion that Uruk, which about 3300 BCE covered a surface of some 200 hectares and had an estimated population of 20 to 50,000 people. Spatial terms, centered on civic institutions, much like what was pictured by Jacobsen, and I quote the book. The public buildings at Uruk seem to have been great communal assembly halls, modeled on the plan of ordinary households, but constructed as houses of the gods. There was also a great court comprising of an enormous sunken plaza, 165 feet across, surrounded by 2 tiers of benches. This sort of arrangement with a congenial space for public meetings is exactly what one would expect were Uruk to have been governed by a popular assembly. They go on to propose that, in the case of Uruk, collective rule thus predates monarchy. Interestingly, this suggestion has seen direct pushback in some of the reviews of the book, including the one by Kwane Appiah in the New York Review of Books, who specifically refers to this claim as, quote, naked conjecture, and sees, quote, the absence of a royal court as being consistent with all sorts of political arrangements, unquote. But I believe that one cannot just substantiate the book's claim that early Uruk wasn't a monarchy, at least not in a traditional sense, but also substantiate its assertion that the city was organized in a form of collective self-rule. And given its textbook importance, the case of Uruk, in turn, has wider implications for the origin myth of all of us, our state. I'll briefly consider 3 points suggesting that executive power at early Uruk was shared between a large number of actors, then introduce the case of Assur 1,000 years later to speak about fluidities of social hierarchy. First, the remarkable absence of personified leadership at Uruk. Although a societal figurehead is identifiable in the visual record, not a single name of a ruler has come down to us, no display inscriptions, no sign of a dynasty. A colleague has recently argued that this was characteristic of early Uruk statehood and set it in marked contrast to contemporaneous Egypt, where dynasty and display come into focus very early on. The analysis of the written record focuses on a key official bearing the title N, who, it's been argued, must be identified with the figurehead shown in the art. But there seems to be an exclusive focus on office, not on the holder. Second, an overall assessment of the administrative record excavated at Uruk. We have the earliest texts known to us from that site, probably where writing was originally invented. Some 4,000 texts came out of the public buildings there. Most of them record modest transactions of raw materials, products, and laborers. Supervision is granular. Access through doors and containers is monitored through the use of official seals. Two interpretations seem possible: a tightly controlled hierarchy in which order is maintained through detailed accounting, or a flat hierarchy in which a large number of individuals are assigned to specific areas of transaction and are monitoring each other constantly. The latter seems to be more likely from what else we know about the place. No evidence of large palaces, no officials mentioned in the record as officiating, etc. It would fit the cosmic role of leadership expressed in the iconography and the absence of the individualization of the N. They were not charismatic aristocrats, but faceless stewards. It was the office that came with the distinct iconography. This does not mean that the N wasn't a significant individual in society. Texts associate him with a large household and tracts of agricultural land, but there is no suggestion of wide-ranging executive power. And here comes my third point. A text found in several manuscripts among these very early records is the so-called Lu list, which provides an inventory of offices and institutional entities found in this early state, arguably the first state. On par with similar lists of farming tools, musical instruments, minerals, and so on, it serves to group a set of concepts according to a coherent overall scheme. Spread among this series of official titles, the inventory contains a set of 10 abstract concepts that identify areas of professional responsibility or officials collectively responsible for those areas. These include the Nam Umush, the consulting body, Nam Uru, the civic body, and Nam Shita, the cultic body. It suggests that the sealings and records from Uruk reflect activities of exactly such corporate entities, and that these are the groups that you, David, suggest met in the assembly area on the Acropolis. The archaic clay tablets are the paper trail, so to say, of this corporate entity that delegates mandate to a large subset of its population and requires close reporting. This looks to me as a possible attempt to reach some level of functional egalitarianism. I end my comments with a brief remark on the city-state of Aswa 1,000 years after Uruk was gone as this kind of state. It's a particularly well-documented example of a corporate constitution with a ceremonial leader. City-state governed by a bicameral assembly was presided by a dynastic ruler, but led by an upper chamber of elders and run by rotating annual public officials. Decrees were subject to majority vote and issued by the assembly. Restraints on rulership were constructed as a division between the secular power of the assembly and the ceremonial power linked to royal performance cult. Royal mandate is reflected in the way rulers style themselves as steward of a deity and president of an assembly, but never king. It would be wrong to simply retroject this Assyrian constitution of 1900 BCE to Uruk 3300 BCE, but the example does provide a clear case from the same cultural area of corporate governance, and it seems to have shared some of its features: the bicameral assembly, ceremonial rule, public office. It also suggests that such systems do appear, disappear, and reappear again and again through time. It speaks to a central point in the book, that we discard old ideas of any original form of human society, and underlines that nothing is inevitable about the way we allow ourselves to be governed, not in Uruk back then, and not here now. Thank you again for your work.
I don't usually do this, but the new computers don't talk to my old printer, which I only discovered a few days ago. In 1994, the Osage scholar Robert Warrior's book, Tribal Secrets, made the first move in what has become a vibrant tradition in American Indian discourse, placing an adjective in front of the word sovereignty. In his case, the word was intellectual. Warrior was responding to what we might see as the consequence of a quarter-century-long indigenous effort to break through the walls of American higher education. That effort had taken its toll, measured in tokenism, marginalization, and as Native intellectuals such as Elizabeth Cook Lynn argued, a loss of mission and identity. Native scholars had responded in turn with a kind of mutual support network that paradoxically robbed them of the intellectualism they desired. And so Warrior called for a robust, self-critical indigenous intellectualism, internal discussions and debates in which Native critics acted formally as critics in relation to one another, rather than as a hard-pressed band of anti-colonial allies. He argued that such intellectualism was not new or exceptional, but would instead mark a return to long traditions found in a range of indigenous life. In the book, he gave that tradition a specific shape by constructing a dialogue between two people who had no connection to one another: my father, Vine Deloria Jr., and an underappreciated Osage intellectual of the 1930s, John Joseph Matthews. And later, as David Graeber and David Wengrow would do with the Wendat statesman Kondirunk, who makes up such a heroic figure, Warrior would excavate other indigenous intellectuals, including Samson Occam, who seems to have schooled Phyllis Wheatley on being a transatlantic intellectual of color, and William Apis, whose blistering polemic on King Philip's War makes clear the intellectual firepower behind the indigenous critique. And we could point to several others. Warrior's critical concept seemed to be intellectualism, and it was, but as important was sovereignty. And he mapped the concept analogically from the political to the intellectual and homed in on the internal structures of administration, representation, and control that allow a sovereign state or a discourse to function as such. As he moved between states and ideas, however, a more significant argument emerged from what we can think of as the flip side of Westphalian sovereignty. That sovereignty also required not only the internal aspects, but the recognition of other states. Or in Warrior's reading, recognition coming from other intellectual formations. Warrior's entire career has been waged on this terrain. because that recognition has been hard to come by, which is why scholars in Native American and indigenous studies have in particular appreciated the ways that the dawn of everything takes it as a central animating presence. The indigenous critique of European social relations and the alternatives offered by Kandiaronk were heard, recognized, received, and debated, and they helped shape European intellectualism around questions of freedom and equality. This is exactly what Robert Warrior was asking for, a fairer and more respectful intellectual history of colonial encounter. So one of the histories of inequality then comes to rest on the other side of this, right? The slapback of the indigenous critique of Europe, which the book argues, saddled us with an unhelpful master narrative built on social evolution, primitivism, modernity, and linear progress. American Indian critiques, powerful because they came from a place of difference that might have gifted Europeans a point of intellectual leverage on themselves. These things were in fact unthinkable because they came from savages. That rejection, right, that particular rejection, didn't just come from nowhere, right? It required the building of a vast edifice of what we can think of as defensive ideas that could only make sense in the context of universality to be imposed on a global scale through European colonialism. So every tribal there and every primitive then needed to be plugged into a social hierarchy and a developmental scale. Add together, if you would, small social group plus isolation plus social non-complexity plus forager subsistence, toss in Christianity with its insistence upon a universalized divinity and historicity, and you've defined this primitive savagery and established the hierarchy in which its people forever sit, incapable of thinking complex thoughts. And of course, the dawn of everything decisively rejects this claim. Humans are humans, and thus capable of thinking and acting everywhere and every when in the same kinds of ways. And those ways are contingent, situational, creative, playful, multiple, local, flexible, experimental. The small thus becomes evidence of a human tendency to separate, distinguish, localize, refuse, transform, and practice schismogenesis, which is a great word, by the way. The simple is revealed as human experimentation based on situational ingenuity rather than social evolutionary patterns and categories that misimpose meaning. Forager turns out to be a strategy imposed across all manner of social organizations, not the origin story of developmental hierarchy, and isolation comes to seem untenable in a world rich with movement. That thing once named the primitive, then, is revealed as a positive value and resource, and not in the sense of a kind of Rousseauian romanticism, but in terms of the patchiness and contingency of human social life. In this, Graeber and Wengrow echo longstanding changes in environmental thinking, for instance, away from developmental theories and toward the discrete histories of patchy landscapes and complex interactions among plants and animals with equally complex water, weather, and soil systems. And I draw this analogy because so many folks in Native America have been struck of late by the new ways forest ecologists, for example, have started talking about webs of interrelation, interspecies communication, contingency, and adaptation. These things show up in the New York Times Magazine as sort of like new and heroic innovations. But like Kandiaronk, I think these native folks might suggest, Indians have been saying exactly these things and for a very long time. Alas, cast as primitives with a little bit of knowledge and a lot of superstition, it could never be taken seriously. The one forward-facing critical conversation in Indian country today concerns the ways that the imposition of the categories religion and science onto native practice has in fact obscured older and deeper knowledges created out of close observation and experimentation, confirmed or rejected in practice, and that these things demand a wider horizon of explanation than either religion or science can provide. And what's cool about the dawn of everything is that it makes room for these possibilities. Where the old hierarchies would insist that indigenous thought was a model of inferior and archaic primitive thought, Graeber and Wengrow's inversion, you can think of it that way, allows us to say it differently. Indigenous thought may be a model of useful, open, ingenious, early human thought that can jump the bounds of both those categories and at least suggest, if not wholly make clear, the possibilities of the present. This project is beset with dangers, of course. It's hard to move from a critique of old models and calls for the new into the actual practice of a new mode of thinking and being. And so we, I think, lament volumes 2 and 3. And Graeber and Wengrow's new narrative, even as it elevates multiplicity and disavows overconfident category building, is nonetheless a new narrative. It rests, as did the social evolutionary story, on a confidence in scientific discovery and a paradigm of objectivity and the inevitabilities of narrative in constructing morals and meanings. Social evolution could not admit when it was wrong, and thus even now, I think, struggles to admit candia rank to the ranks of global intellectuals. Graeber and Wengrow's argument, built on a synthesis of new scholarship, may simply represent a first statement of a Kuhnian paradigm shift, if we might go back that far, which suggests challenges not yet anticipated should it take on paradigmatic form and have archaeologists and anthropologists lining themselves up to defend it. For the book is in many ways a reading of the past that explicitly hopes to speak to change in the present and future, and thus much is at stake. My appreciation for the book, my hopes for future conversation, rest upon what I hope will be an antidote toward any untoward paradigm defense, because it's about common human experience, but a common human experience of contingency, unevenness, agency, and possibility in ways that make it, I think and hope, essentially anti-paradigmatic, right, at its sort of heart and soul. And in that sense, I will close by an observation made by a friend, and Rowan, it goes back to your opening comments, native intellectual who observed of this book appreciately, hopefully, and thank God we can at last be done with Yuval Noah Harari.
So, like Dr. Alcock, I was kind of all over the place in my emotions while reading this book, and so I hope I have synthesized some of them here. So to start with, I'm what we call a historical archaeologist. And one of the first things that came to mind for me while reading The Dawn of Everything is this somewhat arbitrary distinction between prehistory and history, especially as it pertains to archaeology. You can think along the lines of Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. This is something that comes up often for us as archaeologists. How do we define historical? And the answer is always, well, it's complicated. We also know that certain regions and time periods of the world are more likely to be studied archaeologically than others, and histories are not valued equally. Consider a recent project undertaken by our own Rowan Flad here and Bridget Alex on how studies of China are archaeological studies of China are vastly underreported in mainstream scientific journals. So this brings me to one of the most important aspects of Wengrow and Graeber's book. Who gets to tell history? Whose history is valued? What prejudices are either hidden or overtly expressed in popular narratives? The book argues that the myth of good things coming from Europe or the West is used to assuage a lot of colonial guilt to make it seem as though where we have arrived, stuck, as they say, in our current moment, was unavoidable. This is a crucial point to make. It's also important to realize that if those who are telling, writing, or sometimes outright making up history deem something impossible or a certain group as incapable of an act, in many ways that becomes fact. So here I'd like to make a push for the work of Trudeau in Silencing the Past, in which he essentially says this in his discussion of the Haitian Revolution. I also bring this up because this new history of humanity isn't exactly new. It's a new organization way of looking at it and putting in this book for so many people to see and to access. But a lot of people, especially people of color, have been making these sort of similar arguments. But again, perhaps our chance here is to reach a wider audience and to produce a book that raises truly new questions that should be starting points for future research. This is also integral to the argument being made by the authors, that we are asking the wrong questions. I say this all the time. I counter this incessantly in my work with human remains, especially in my work with members of the African diaspora. Much of this shift in my own specialty only came about through the work of collaborative archaeology with descendant communities. However, even recent critiques of this sort of collaborative archaeology have pointed out that oftentimes it's only collaborative in name. So we have to also think about, again, whose questions we're asking and if we're actually being collaborative and helping the communities who we are researching. Overall, in the book, I would like to see some more contributions and citations by people of color, and in particular, more indigenous and black folks. I feel it's important to consider the work of our intellectual forebears, including Boaz, who turns up in this book and who is near and dear to my heart. But I think we need to consider more of what living folks are saying, especially living people of color, rather than just dead white men, which is constantly, come up in our field a lot. Further, there are a lot of binaries that are being reproduced, many of which have been attributed to Enlightenment thought. And so one of the things that really stood out to me in this discussion, I want to know, where are the queer people? So there's a lot of discussions of men and then sometimes women in that history. But I really want to know, as we move forward and take up some of these questions in this book, how we can look at other marginalized groups. And part of this issue is, if we're, who do we deem qualified to be asking questions and who answers the questions? What forms do these qualifications take to be considered scholarly, and who do they exclude? So if you read this book carefully, you know that to understand our current moment, how we got stuck, we do need to understand our complete history, both prehistoric and historic, whatever those mean. So the events from long ago are still with us. In my research, I often invoke the work of Christina Sharp and her theory of the wake, in which she talks about the wake of slavery, the wake of the water, the wake as a form of mourning. So we are living in the wake of so many events, and to understand the varied perspectives and responses and experiences we're all having, we must consider perspectives outside of our own and also those that took place very long ago. I'd like to take a moment just to focus on a recent event that really resonated with me while finishing up The Dawn of Everything. As you are all likely aware, Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom has passed away last week on the 8th. A tweet by Dr. Uju Anya, professor and researcher in applied linguistics at Carnegie Mellon University, made headlines for a tweet, which read, "I heard the chief monarch of a thieving, raping, genocidal empire is finally dying. May her pain be excruciating." Now, whether or not you agree with this sentiment, let's consider some of the backlash against Nigerian-born Dr. Anya. Most of the discourse I saw focused on notions of respect and how it was insensitive and rude to say things while people were still grieving. Mind you, at the same time, I saw images of Irish folks taking to their stadiums and celebrating the Queen's death, but I didn't see as much backlash as this one lone Black woman scholar received. And here again, I thought of the wake. Who is given the grace to grieve and whose grief matters? Certainly not the grief of Indigenous and Black. Dr. Anya and others are commenting on the role that the British monarchy played in colonialism and the damage done the world over by the colonial project. People often like to say that such events happened so long ago that they don't matter, either ignoring or choosing to be ignorant of the fact that many countries only recently gained their independence, many are still occupied, and no matter when it happened, the wake of colonial violence is lasting, and it affects nearly every aspect of our lives. Here we might consider some of the contributions of Frantz Fanon and the experiences of the colonized subject. Integral to all this, of course, is violence, which comes up a lot in The Dawn of Everything. Here's another suggestion. We can talk more about the many forms that violence takes, whether we invoke structural violence or consider newer contributions to studies of violence, such as slow violence, as proposed by Rob Nixon, in which he looks at the effects of capitalism on the environment and how disproportionately the harm and people of color are harmed. Further, we might consider necropolitics as defined by Akile Mbembe. It is how the state, if you will, which we again cannot necessarily define, maintains control, inspired by Foucault's concept of biopolitics. This nuance it brings in is just not these immediate acts of violence, say executing your own countryman or executing an enemy. Instead, we're looking at the power to dictate who may live and who may die. This means the state is still complicit in deaths when it chooses to not act, to not offer aid. More recently, anthropologist Carolyn Rouse used necropolitics to consider the disproportionate suffering of Black and Latinx communities in the United States during COVID. But none of this means that people are not actors or do not have agency, a topic that The Dawn discusses. Agency has been theorized many ways, and oftentimes notions of freedom are brought up. Here, the authors invoke freedom in 3 ways: the ability to move or relocate, the freedom to ignore or disobey commands, and the freedom to shape entirely new social realities or shift between them. In my own work, this really resonated with me in the similar discussions we have in the Archaeology of the African Diaspora and how we define freedom. And it's always oftentimes just in opposition to enslavement. But there's a lot more to it. There's a lot more, perhaps, degrees of freedom or types of freedom. And so I'd like to conclude with one final thought that came to me actually on the second to the last page of the book. Not to end on a down note, but here we go. You say, we are optimists. And I applaud your optimism, I truly do. I wish I could be an optimist. However, I'm a self-proclaimed pessimist. And I just want to remind everyone that, people of color, the colonized, the marginalized, whatever you might call us, don't owe anyone optimism. As Ta-Nehisi Coates brought up in one of his interviews shortly before he decided to get off of social media, we often have very little reason to be optimistic. However, this book and the suggestions being made in the future routes that scholars might take to do research, new questions, give me a little bit of optimism, and I hope that this does change.
Oh, really? Okay. Am I audible? I'm not sure.
Perhaps I should say that David did not have a chance to see all these remarks beforehand, so he's going to wing it with his customary brilliance.
Taking notes. I just want to say thank you, first of all, for and let me know if you can't hear me, just for having me here and for the hospitality. I really appreciate it, and especially Dan and Rowan for all the work you've put into this. Just before I come on to the notes I've been taking on all your comments, I just wanted to begin by paying tribute to my co-author, David Graeber. We recently passed the 2-year anniversary of his death. He didn't live, sadly, to see the publication of the book or some of those critical reviews, but I think it's well documented that he didn't have an easy time at the Ivy Leagues, to say the least. So I find myself wondering what he would have made of the book's reception here. We'll never know, but I'm absolutely sure that he would have been incredibly grateful and appreciative for these really thoughtful reactions and rich and generous thoughts. So thank you, first of all, very much. I have made some notes, so allow me to attempt in a way that will do no justice as usual to any of the presentations, just to share some thoughts on the hoof. I won't, sometimes I find it easier to go in reverse order, but I think I won't actually. If I go back to Sue. Yeah, you raised this question about memory and the transmission of knowledge and of traditions, and I take your point with regard to, let's say, technology, material culture, but I think I would make the argument that in other senses, which perhaps Phil's comments touched on, memory is really central to the message of the book, because very often what we're trying to do is recover processes of remembering, or memory work, as it's sometimes called a bit clumsily, where we feel that there is evidence for people acting collectively based on a very conscious rejection of what has gone before in their experience, and that it is possible to recover these acts of rejection. And even in the absence of conventional written historical sources, we can point to cases where what one might think of as a revolution takes place. But of course, the word revolution, and particularly the way that it's used in archaeology, has always come to mean sort of the opposite of memory, in the sense that, people talk about hunter-gatherers And then one is supposed to have the agricultural revolution, which sort of wipes the slate clean, right? So the minute a sheep, woolly sheep turns up, or a leaf, corn, it's as if somehow everyone suddenly forgets everything that happened before, and none of the previous categories apply, and we're into a completely new form of society. That's exactly the kind of impression we're trying to counteract. I think it was Tolstoy who had a very simple, I think elegant definition of revolution, which is different. Simply as what happens when a people changes its orientation to power. And if we just take that very simple definition of revolution, then I think partly what we're arguing, although it's perhaps not as explicit as it might be, is that history is full of those. Or even what is sometimes called prehistory is full of those. I mean, we talk about societies that in those terms had a revolution every autumn or fall, on the basis of seasonal or transformations of political structures. So anyway, this is sort of in defense of the place of memory generally in the book, while accepting your points about the transmission of crafts and so on and so forth.
And I can't argue with him now.
I hope that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah.
And thank you again. Gojko, thank you so much for those comments, all of which I need to think about much more. David wrote in previous works about what he considered to be the double standards which are routinely applied in discussions of democracy. It's my favorite piece of his about this is called "There Never Was a West," where he just makes the simple point that our received model for the origin of democracy, 5th century Athens, was a slave-holding society where chattel slavery was regarded as normal. It was a society that was rather militant and in which women were entirely excluded from the realm of politics. And this is our model for the origins of democracy. And yet, when democratic practices, in the sense of human beings just sitting around collectively finding ways to make decisions without coercing each other, when these things are reported elsewhere, be it in the pre-Columbian Americas or sub-Saharan Africa, there's always a get-out clause, like why it's not really democracy. And yet, in the Greek case, we make exceptions. So I wasn't surprised when the day came when he asked me about Thorkild Jakobsen, who I'd forgotten was a local. And what happened? We had a lot of these kind of conversations. Say, what happened to that idea? What happened to that debate, as we were discussing yesterday? What happened to so-called primitive democracy in ancient Mesopotamia? To which, I had to frankly confess, I don't really know either. I mean, I don't really get it. It's a little bit like the so-called influence debate about the American Constitution, or the question of matriarchal societies. These are debates that essentially got killed in the academy. They didn't survive whatever institutional structures we're working in. It's not that anybody sort of, thoroughly refuted the case or even, exhaustively explored it. People, to some extent, with the notable exception of Gojko himself, just stopped talking about it. And it was important to me to be forced to confront these questions again, because when people like Jakobsen proposed those ideas, they were exciting. And they spilt over way beyond ancient history or archaeology. They got philosophers talking, they got political science, they got everyone talking. And I think somehow, something's clearly gone wrong, in the way that topics just get kind of, it's like death by 1,000 cuts until they slowly fizzle out and vanish. And I can't explain how it works, but it's strangely effective. And it is partly about citation. I agree. Okay, coming on to Phil. Thank you, Phil. Is almost all I've got to say. As you know, I'm myself on a very steep learning curve, and realizing how much more literature there is which is pertinent to the material in the book, which we were drawn to, and I'm referring here to not just Kandiaronk, but our whole characterization of that colonial encounter in the northeastern part of North America, which we were drawn to with a very particular question in mind, which was about trying to understand the broader intellectual milieu within which Rousseau, not just Rousseau, but all those who began around the middle of the 18th century debating the origins of inequality, where that came from. And we did not have a clue. I mean, we did not anticipate at all that the history of the Huron-Wendat nation would come to play such a central role in the book, even to the extent that our reading of those sources actually completely redefined the purpose of the book. I mean, it became the framing of the book itself. That wasn't in any sense planned. We just found ourselves drawn into the literature, making the best use that we could of the sources. And ultimately, I think it does come back to the question that Sue, I think, asked, which is, why is it necessary at all to have to even make these points? That other people were smart, that other people had intellectual traditions, is kind of extraordinary when you think about it. And with that, I'll just come on to Asia's comments. Thank you also, Asia. I was secretly hoping you'd talk more about museums and galleries, because I think they have a lot to answer for. And actually it occurred to me when we were chatting earlier that museums, especially colonial museums, are maybe like the most perfect instantiation of something we talk about in the book, which is what happens when acts of violence, which you did address, not just that acts of violence become systemic, but that they are brought into contact through institutions with their opposites, with what you might call systems of care. Because, of course, at one level, this is the idea of a museum. It's where objects go for conservation and archiving, and they get lovingly caressed and, cared for. But of course, when those objects originate in acts of violence, something else happens, which I'm not sure we understand terribly well. But I think it has a lot to do with what you call structural violence and the way that ephemeral and traumatic acts of actual violence are transformed into something that is actually much more durable. They become iconic, they become symbolic of hierarchies. That's just something that I see a relationship there which I don't pretend to even remotely understand, but I think there's something there to be unpicked maybe. And just with regard to who we cite and who we don't cite, I hope that the scholars who we do cite will be more widely discussed. I don't. It's a difficult point to react to. I hope that the work of Georges Suy will be read again. It hasn't since the 1990s. I don't personally count citations, and perhaps there aren't enough of this or that, but the contributions of those scholars are not exchangeable. They're not interchangeable with other contributions. They are the result of PhD theses. They answer very specific points that were important to us in the book. It would be nice to hear them talked about, actually, when it comes to this issue. I'm really grateful for all the comments, and I'm going to be thinking about them for a long time. And thank you again for your warm reception of the book and of me. And I will stop talking if that's all right.
So I'm Dan Smale. This event, the part of the idea for this event actually came out of this class that Matt and I teach because we'd been engaging with Graeber and Wengrow's work for some time in our deep history course, dealing with, in particular, the week where we work with inequality. And what was so striking about the book when it came out is that we, at least, Matt, I won't speak for you, but I'll speak for myself. I realized that I had been caught in the trap of thinking about inequality that is at the very center of the book's critique, parts of which you have heard already. The book is large, it's complex. We've only gotten at fractions of your fascinating components. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, I urge you to go and look at it. When I first began chatting with David about this, probably about 10 months ago or so, when we finally got together on a Zoom just to chat about how we might bring David here to speak with us. And I hope my memory corresponds with yours. Speaking about memory, I was thinking my own joy is to promote conversation and to think about things, and especially conversations that involve the everywhere and the everywhen and across silos is what makes us tick. And I said to David, somewhat with some temerity, I hope you would be willing to come and not give a 50-minute lecture, but just participate in a conversation. And as I recall, David, you said, thank God, that's what I would love to do, more than yet another talk. So I just wanted to thank then Sue and Gojko and Phil and Asia for leading us off on this conversation so wonderfully well, and for David for being able to respond to it. And the point now is one of the things that was really important to Rowan and I as we were chatting with this and Susie and other people was to open the conversation to even larger audiences. So we have 50 minutes now before the reception now to gather thoughts. I'm going to ask Louis to come up here and take the microphone because Louis Escobar, the history department, is going to help me pass this around to you. We need to record it for the people on the live stream. So what we'd really like to get is thoughts from you. We have undergraduates, we have graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, faculty, guests, visitors. We have a diverse audience here, and we want to hear from as many of you as possible. I'm sure many of you will want to talk to David about the book. You've read the book, it's very exciting. All the panelists are available to talk and develop some of the remarks that they've developed. So without further ado, let's collect some hands from people in the audience and get some questions. I'm going to pass the microphone. And please introduce yourself, Julia.
Hello, thank you again. My name is Julia Puglisi. I'm a G6 in Egyptology in NELC. Would like to thank you all for a riveting conversation and hope we can get started. I have a very quick question with maybe not a quick answer, but during periods of perceived collapse or decline of a first or second order society or state, if we want to call it that, their dusk, if you will, how do the major tenets in the book, ideas about what makes us human and what makes human history, the mechanics of what makes human history, help us understand why civilizations end, if at all?
I was hoping the topics would get easier. But is it me?
I think so. Julia, right?
Would anyone else by any chance? We have things to say in the book about the concept of civilization, which I guess would define or maybe redefine the parameters of your question when you ask why civilizations come to an end. I think we can show very easily that states sometimes come to an end, kingdoms come to an end, empires sort of come to an end, but not really. But I think I would find it very difficult to talk about the end of civilization, partly for the reasons we go into in the book, which is that our kind of habitual way of talking about civilizations, particularly ancient Egypt and other ancient civilizations, is rather paradoxical. When we talk about civilized behavior, it's generally got something to do with cooperation, respect, and dignity. But when it comes to classifying past societies as civilizations, we tend to go for the ones that did the opposite. Empires and societies of a certain brutality and monumentality. And part of the argument about the book is that, the term clearly isn't going away. I think somebody did actually write a book called Killing Civilization. Didn't work, and arguably it's not very civilized. But it doesn't seem to want to go away, this word. So why don't we try and redefine it? I mean, we do have these phenomena in the archaeological record that nobody knows what to call them. They used to be called culture areas in anthropology as well. The Germans called them Kulturkreise, culture circles. Now they invent all kinds of great jargon like interaction spheres and whatnot. But the truth is, we're talking very often about very large-scale networks of demographically sparse groups, which nevertheless form regional confederacies of, maybe confederacy is not a bad word, but regional confederacies. And this does come down to transmission, along which people and things and ideas flow for hundreds or even thousands of years with no clear evidence of coercion or top-down centralized coordination. Now, actually, the sociologist Marcel Mauss proposed in the early 20th century that why don't we call those civilizations? And I think it's not a bad proposition. In which case, when they end actually becomes an easier question. They end when they end largely through violence. They end through empire, colonialism, and genocide.
There's a new edition of the Thames and Hudson big textbook, archaeology textbook called The Human Past, and they've asked us to remove the word civilization across the board.
Maybe it'll work this time.
Please, and please introduce yourself.
Okay. Hi, my name's Alasia. It's like Malaysia without the M. I'm a postdoctoral fellow for the Inequality in America Initiative, and my background is in human development and family science. So these are topics that are new to me that I'm processing and thinking through. And something that I found interesting was your guys' conversations about museums. And one thought that I had is when we think about memorializing racial violence, for instance, and putting them in museums, I thought about things like the Confederate flags, things like swastika, and how when you see those things, a lot of times you have a very visceral response to that when you think about the violence that that particular thing symbolizes. And so I think about that same thing being in a museum, like Trayvon Martin's hoodie being in a museum. And my question is, and again, I guess this is more just not specific to the book, but just in general, what kind of impact does it have on an individual's psyche when we put these type of things into museums? And why do we see that as different than it just being, if like, say for instance, if we have the Confederate flag in a museum, why is that different than just seeing it necessarily just out and about? So that's my question, is about this idea of monumentalizing, if that's a word, racial violence in museums.
I think
And that being a tradition that we just kind of normally accept in our society. Like, why is that seen as acceptable? Why is that normative?
I think there are people on the panel who are better qualified than me to respond, if that's okay.
Poor Aja.
I mean, when it comes to museums, so closer to like what anthropologists, archaeologists work with, we often work with these like old, like the Peabody. They started as these sort of like culture history museums, sort of things, ethnology museums. And so most of the collections are stolen, as most of us know. They're looted from all over the world. And therefore, like the simplest argument is when putting certain things on display, it's like, that's stolen, it doesn't belong to you, put it back, you didn't have consent for that. When it comes to more recent things, I think the context and especially the exhibitions and what they're trying to get across really matters. So for example, I went to Germany for the first time this summer, and I was so impressed with their museums and how they discuss World War II and the Holocaust in a way that I think the United States will never be able to discuss like slavery or something. Like it's just there. And it's this undeniable fact about this, this thing that happened, and we're going to acknowledge it, and actually talk about what happened and everything that led up to it. Here in the United States, it really depends, because like there could be, an exhibition where they're talking about the Confederacy and perhaps they have this old Confederate flag or something. Or you could be, I was in Missouri. I went into some local museum and there were little hats with Confederate flags for sale, like that you could wear, like kids' hats, okay? Like, and those are two completely different uses of that symbolism. And especially like, I feel like in the proper context in a museum, these symbols that really came to represent hate and oppression, it's important to see them and get that background and for folks to be able to understand why they are so damaging. I mean, out in the wild, seeing Confederate flags is just like, at least for me personally, pretty jarring. I mean, I'm from New York, and you'd be shocked at the amount of Confederate flags that are in upstate New York, and they don't seem to realize that we were on the side of the Union. But to so many people, they're like, oh, this just means rebellion. It means like whatever. And I'm like, but you, like, there's some very strange mental acrobatics going on, as I like to say. And a lot of it comes down to just white supremacy. Which actually, to get at the heart of your question, I feel like the answer oftentimes is white supremacy. It's trying to keep people in certain places, and museums can really be a tool of that. Wherein if you keep certain people or cultures always on display, or always, like the perpetual kind of like childlike state, or something that we might often put like Indigenous Americans in, or Black folks, the museum is like an authority. People can learn that, and you view people that way. So I think it's really important that we look at museums like as they are, and we really reform them and really consider what we're putting on display, and who's, how our exhibitions, how our museum education, how all of those things work, because they're really important. I think it's a really undervalued aspect of our society, especially for museums, like the many museums that are like free and open to the public. Like they're a great resource. Did I answer your question? Did I ramble?
Thank you. Perhaps we'll come back over here and then jump over there for the next.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Andrew DeLucas. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Department of NELC, Near Eastern Languages and I suppose culture area. I want to thank you guys all for being here today. I do have a rather pointed question regarding Dawn of Everything. So for the field of ancient Near Eastern studies, as well as Levantine scholarship, Max Weber's patrimonialism holds particular esteem. This is a model that sort of finds its way within the chapter on the origin of the state, or perhaps lack thereof. My question is really, what do we gain from utilizing this model? What assumptions are brought in utilizing perhaps Dr. Barjamovic's address and calling them patrimonial households? Why use this term? What do we gain from it? What are we assuming when we impose this on our readings?
Yeah, there's a problem with a big book because it's often hard to remember exactly which bit you're talking about, but I think I know what you're talking about, and it's where we're discussing something that came up actually yesterday in conversation with the Egyptologist Victoria. Oh, there she is. Yeah, it's kind of fascinating thing that seems to recur across a number of cases of what some people call early state formation, is about gender and the fact that it's quite frustrating. It's often around the very earliest beginnings of the written record, when you're hoping to get some new insights into what's actually going on. You see this interesting thing where references to women in positions of authority are initially, when writing is still very limited in its functions, they're actually very common. Except you can't say a great deal about them because writing is still used for extremely restricted purposes, so we don't get a long excursus on how exactly the constitution of this or that place worked. But you can see that they are there. And then they tail off. And what you're left with, whether we're talking, Rowan may correct me, about Shang China or early dynastic Mesopotamia, or Old Kingdom Egypt, or the Aztec Triple Alliance, or whatever, you're left with a model of a polity, a political unit, a political system, which takes as its template the idea of what Weber would indeed have called a patrimonial household or a patrimonial system, where the king, conceived in masculine terms, is sort of the shepherd of his people, and the land is his sort of extended estate. And I do think that the language of the state has been extended too broadly to ancient history, and that it stopped paying dividends, I mean, intellectually a long time ago, to refer to all of these different things as states. I know not everyone agrees with me on this point, but what we tried to do in the book, strangely via the figure of Kim Kardashian, but we don't have to go into that, is deconstruct the notion of the state as applied comparatively and break it down into a more, we hope, a more exact definition of systems of power based around three different principles, one of which Phil has discussed as sovereignty, and the others are based on sovereignty, control over knowledge or information, and the third is personal charisma. So with the use of those ideas about patriarchy, we're trying to ask a question. Again, we don't have the answers, but at least trying to pose the question of what came before these very well evidenced, highly patriarchal systems, which then forces you to confront the issue of other kinds of systems, which is often where the conversation breaks down, and archaeologists don't particularly want to talk about them. So we're trying to shift the debate a bit by doing that.
Hi, my name is Vicky Almanza. I am a junior fellow at the Society of Fellows, and I am an Egyptologist. So thank you all for this very thought-provoking and stimulating discussion. So my question is concerns the book, The Dawn, how this frequent theme of questioning elements that appear together, such as government and monumentality, or agriculture, farming, and settlements, how you question all this correlation between these elements. So my question, I guess, is there any element that you still think is a constant in inequality in past and present societies? Or if you will, another way to frame this question will be, is there any of these previous assumptions that we have remain constant as well after your re-examination of all these different societies?
When you say constant, you mean in the sense of a set of values that one could trace across the ages, to say that one has more or less of it? I mean, this is, I think, now become very typical of the way that people across a whole range of fields are approaching inequality, is to take, as I was talking with the students this morning, to take something like the famous Thomas Piketty book and the kind of metrics that are used there, Gini coefficients and such like, and extend them way beyond, recent history, even back to the last ice age, where we've had, estimates of daily income in dollars and cents, for Paleolithic mammoth hunters and this kind of thing, is increasingly a very common approach, and it's predicated on precisely what you suggest, the idea that one can find a common axis along which all societies could be compared, presumably ultimately with the aim of being able to talk about causality and why inequality, why rates of inequality go up and down in particular situations. And I think, as we say in the book, it's a very laudable ambition. I'm personally yet to be convinced that it's really produced any great insights, partly because when you reduce things to one measure, the selection invariably from a cultural standpoint is rather arbitrary. You know, I've seen very extensive, statistically rigorous studies that just compare enormous spans of time and space. You know, the whole of Eurasia, the whole of the Americas, by measuring the size of buildings. Houses, buildings. Actually, not even houses, just buildings. At no point is it asked what's going on in the buildings. They just measure them. And they come out with metrics on inequality and make, you know, very general assertions about was there more inequality here or less inequality there. I'm personally not sure that kind of approach answers the questions which the investigators have set themselves. I think it's telling us something. You know, the data they produce is interesting. You can probably interpret it in other ways. I'm not saying it's pointless, but I don't think it necessarily tells us a great deal about social inequality. Because as we say in the book, you know, we have examples of societies which actually found the whole notion that material differences, just having a bigger house than somebody or having more stuff than somebody, the idea that those kind of differences could automatically be translated into authority or influence has actually been quite alien to well-documented, known human societies. It is not a universal, and I don't think it should be used as a default assumption in making inferences about rates of inequality. So the short answer is just no.
Thank you.
We're moving back here now.
Hi, I'm Ryan Lowe. I'm a fifth year in the history department, studying medieval France. So a lot of the panelists and public reviews have all brought up how the book sort of calls upon us to respond to contingency and experiment with different political structures and to sort of play with our ideas of what society is and can be. But I guess I have this question of who gets to play, who gets to do the experimenting, and who has to sit on the sidelines, watch everyone else play, and then live with the consequences of their playing and all the rules they come up with. And I guess I have two sort of ways of asking this question. The first is what studying prehistory has taught you about who gets to be playful and experimental and who doesn't. And then sort of looking into the future, when you wrote that, you know, when you and David Graeber wrote that you're optimists and that you were sort of hopeful that people would take this upon themselves, this challenge upon themselves to be more creative and imaginative, who did you have in mind as your audience? Who did you have in mind as being more creative and imaginative?
Sue, would you like to have a crack at this, and then we'll turn it over to David? We'll give you a little rest here for a moment.
Very kind.
Yeah, the question of, you know, who got to play in the past, I think you have to first ask the question, and I think what was kind of, you know, stunning to me reading the book was just this awareness that, you know, are we looking for the experimenters? Are we looking for the out there folk? And the answer is usually no. We're trying to figure it out. It's hard enough to figure out the basics without worrying about the fluff. Well, it's not fluff. It's essential. I think, you know, the topsy-turviness of the book can help us go back and look for who might have been playing. But I think it's very, very clear that, and you know, I'm a Romanist. You know, play was, you know, for some and certainly not for others. The question is, you know, the variety of that through time. Going forward, this is kind of why I know it sounds hokey, but going back to the role of teaching in our world, you know, I think not the big change the world that Graeber and Professor David was after, but that, you know, incremental awareness of, you know, other people's humanity and other people's capacity to change and other people's right to play is something that we can all do. Every little bit helps. I give you enough of a break?
Thank you.
and if I can
battle war.
If I can ventriloquize perhaps for Phil here, it seems to me the thrust of your remarks is that indigenous people in North America once were able to play and then lost that ability. So that.
Yeah. I mean, it feels like part of the argument here is that the creativity may be sort of best experienced in sort of small, heterodox, diverse kinds of things, right? And that there's some, I don't know if you'd agree, David, right? That there's a sort of sense of like moments of multiple diversities possible, right? And localisms possible. And sort of, you know, perhaps a kind of closing down over time as sort of larger structures are created. But within that, always the possibility, right, of additional and new, diverse kinds of experimental, playful kinds of things that happen and unfold on them. It's why I think you go to James Scott kind of near the end of the book, right? And you've got this sort of sense about like states and margins and things like that. But it does feel to me like if you take that question and transpose it, Ryan, I wonder if this is your question, into the present moment, it feels a little harder to imagine that, right? I mean, you end up talking about sort of like counterculture, countersocial kinds of movements that are they may be playing on the margins, but are they actually do they have any potentiality or any future?
Am I allowed to?
Yes,
Okay. So David was a great advocate of the philosophical approach of a man called Roy Baska, sometimes called critical realism. And I always regret not talking to David more about this. But as I understand it, one of Roy's arguments is that a lot of academic life is fundamentally unserious. People talk the talk, but they never walk the walk. And it occurred to me a while ago, sitting on a platform rather like this in Berlin, at a place called the Haus der Kulturen der Welt, where we're having a very serious, earnest conversation about God knows what, that there is a weird thing that goes on where, you know, forms of human activity, which perhaps should be really serious, end up becoming forms of play, and vice versa. And it suddenly, I think we were talking about international relations, and it suddenly occurred to me that actually, you know, why doesn't political discussion look more like this? Look at what goes on in our parliament back home in Britain. I mean, it looks like they're having great fun. They're playing. They're fooling around with our lives. And here we are sitting by the fireplace having deeply serious conversations about this and that. So, I mean, it's not an original point. I think it was first made in a very interesting series of debates between the Dutch medievalist Johann Hausenga and the Nazi scholar Carl Schmitt, were precisely about how things move back and forth between the realms of play and seriousness. And you're quite right that it turns out to be quite a recurring theme in the book, is that we argue that institutions, including monarchy, which people have sought an origin for, don't really have an origin, but they begin in the realm of play as it overlaps into things like ritual and ceremony, carnival, and then at some times, for interesting reasons that we don't fully understand, they break out of the realm of play and into the realm of seriousness. And this, I think we would argue, is where societies can get stuck, is precisely when they forget that they were just playing, actually, and that there are alternatives.
If I can, just before we move to the next question, just provide some context for some people who haven't yet had a chance to work all the way through the book. Part of the reason that play becomes so important in the argument, if you may permit me to summarize something, is that the standard model assumes that I'll just call it the socioeconomic formation of forager societies of the past, lock them into a kind of a simple, non-complex egalitarianism. And one of the really interesting features of the book is to argue that they could move between different political structures. This is this idea of play. They could turn over certain times of the year to things that could be systematically political and unequal in some level, but then leave that behind and move on to different things. This is part of the play. And so you get much, much more complex societies in the deep past, which unstitches the idea that socioeconomic formation drives structures of inequality.
Mm-hmm.
Could I add something to that real quick, though? I had a question I'm sorry, didn't remember your name. Ryan. Were you also asking, the way I interpreted it, were you asking who now has the freedom to explore these ideas? Like,
Well, I was asking sort of even within a society, even within a society where, let's say, people are generally free to ignore the rules, for example, to recognize the rules and choose not to obey them. Even in a society like that, like it's still, that society is constructed, and there are people who decide that this is going to be our value system, and there are people who maybe, I imagine, have no say in the construction of that society. Even in even in Neolithic and Paleolithic time, like there were people in the community who decided that they would do, that the community would do certain things in the spring and other things in the fall. And then I'm just kind of curious, were there people also in those communities who had no say in the construction of those, in the performance of those experiments?
Because I actually read your comments the same way as I think you did.
I thought
so
it was just
I would
me.
appreciate
Me too.
you go with your thoughts.
I thought it was just me. So I interpreted it as, like, in your end with your optimistic call for new questions and whatever, who of us, like, scholars or people out in the world actually have the freedom to do that? Because if you're an early career scholar, you can't just go off and be like, I'm going to try to rewrite history. Like, we don't have that luxury oftentimes. And so I was going to say it's up to senior scholars and folks with tenure to really encourage their students when they want to ask these questions. Like, I would never have done my dissertation topic if it hadn't been for my advisor, because everyone else would be like, why are you researching this? And now it turns out it's really important. So, like, we just have to give support to people who would play, who would ask these questions, and make it doable. Yeah.
If I could follow up that comment, something that occurred to me in the discussion up till now, and that actually relates to Marcel Mauss, who David mentioned earlier, is we've been reading Mauss just recently in a seminar that I'm doing about technology and the concept of technology, for whom he is a seminal figure in the kind of early discourse on this term and this concept. And there was an offhand comment in his piece on techniques that struck me as we were reading it the other day, which relates to the comment you asked previously about how certain intellectual ideas get killed, which was that in that discussion of techniques, which is a little bit tedious and pedantic in the end, because he's talking about what it is that ethnographers should be doing in order to understand techniques in all the societies in which they are making observations. He makes this offhand comment that dismisses a current trend at the time in discussions of emergence of agriculture that seemed, in his opinion, if I'm not misremembering the phrasing, to overemphasize the role that women played in this process, which is super ironic in the relationship to the subsequent 100 years of conversations about the origins of agriculture as a phenomenon, because it's in recent times that it's been recognized or articulated or emphasized that there must have been a greater participation of women and people of different genders in the processes that led to new ways of engaging with the natural world, at least according to the ways in which we assume that people were across society to engage in certain types of activities. And my reading of Mauss's offhand comment is that there was a little bit of too much conversation going on, which isn't cited, by people who were overemphasizing the roles of women, which Mauss is essentially squashing in the context of this commentary. And I'm a fan of Mauss in many ways, but this was a remarkable thing that I observed, because I think, in short, it's the assertions of people who are situated in positions of power within the academy and within intellectual discourse that enables certain ideas to be emphasized and others to be killed. And so when it comes to the point of who gets to play, I think oftentimes that really does relate to the configurations of power within the academy as much as it does to the data that we're dealing with.
Can I just, because Rowan, your points also reminded me of something in your presentation, Asia, which I forgot to respond to, which was about non-binary and gender in the book, which is a point that's come up before in discussions, and it's quite true. The treatment of gender in the book doesn't go explicitly into any of those issues and is fairly simple and binary. I think it's completely consistent with the spirit of the book and the arguments of the book to go beyond that. I think the reason it ended up that way is because, to our minds, we were pushing back against some pretty anti-female arguments. And the reason you reminded me of it, you're talking about the origins of agriculture. You know, a lot of that discourse we felt is really quite openly hostile to the idea of women's innovations or women's science. And I've struggled with this since the last time somebody asked me that question. Is like, how do you do both things at once? I guess I'm just not clever enough. But you know, how do you push back against an argument that's predicated on binary principles, but at the same time critique the principle of? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
I know there's a way to do it. Probably lots of other cleverer people than me have done it, but I think that's why those passages read the way they do, if that's any help in just trying to reconstruct the thinking process.
Well, I think that's like another book into itself, essentially.
Right, right. I think that's right, yeah.
Thank you for waiting patiently. Our next question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aldo. I'm an undergrad here at the History Department at Harvard. I actually think my question synthesizes a lot of the comments rather well. So, you know, we're talking about inequality in the 21st century, arguably identity to a certain extent as well. And, you know, the reason why we've convened here is inequality past and present. I'm curious about, you know, fortunately, inequalities that persist in the future. You know, many of my peers right now, we want to study this, want to make and change in some sort of way moving forward, but we're not exactly quite sure about how to do that. So my question for all of you actually, or whoever has comments on this matter is, for those of us who want to be involved in this very, very tempestuous topic, why is the academic field something, or how is the academia uniquely equipped to solve these problems? You know, we mentioned all these different disciplines, from archaeology to history to economics as well, with, you know, Thomas Piketty. Why should someone my age, why should my classmates and I enter academia rather than, let's say, law and jurisprudence, for example?
Gojko, I wonder.
Yeah, Gojko.
No, I want to.
Not on this one. Don't ask the Assyriologist about that.
Well,
what I can say, I suppose, is that, and this is a rather cynical remark, but looking at history over 3,300 years in this case, which an Assyriologist does, everything seems to come around again. And one of the things that is really striking is this kind of sort of, you can modularize history to a certain extent, but you will see these repetitions. Some periods, gender morphs and ideas of gender morph in society. In other periods, you will see that sort of the economic conditions change completely. Again, over 3,000 years, they tend to come back. You will see these kinds of pendulars work. Does that mean that if you just sit down and wait, everything will be okay? I'm not sure.
I think part of my question was inspired by Dean Bobo's comment at the beginning, and it was an invitation to think how this book, among other things, permits people in Assyriology and NELC to contribute to really important conversations about inequality. But you've partially answered that. You partially brought that up. Can we turn to Sue, and then we'll come back to David?
Very brief. I mean, I've thought a lot about your question when I'm talking to, intelligent, caring students who want to go on, but they also see other paths. And my answer is usually, for the field of archaeology, if you can think of something else you could do and be happy, do that instead. But if you can, if you're just like completely hooked, I think, grow up and do do what the Davids did, be very excellent scholars in your own right, but always keep that dimension of yourself open to speaking to the public, getting out there. And fortunately, I've been in administration for a few years now. That is coming more and more, faculty and public engagement being recognized as part of the package, as part of what goes into your tenure. We're not quite there yet, but I think your generation can do it.
Yeah, I like the premise of the question, which is that I don't think we should take for granted that the academy has the answers, and I think we should also consider the extent to which the academy obfuscates the issues.
Yeah.
How much knowledge is produced, which actually distracts us. There's a point I was discussing with Dan the other night about the book by the French social historian Pierre Rosanvallon. In English, it's The Society of Equals, where he just makes the simple observation that the better we get at measuring inequality, all these precise metrics, the less capable we seem to be of actually doing anything about it. It's quite sobering, actually. I think part of the problem with this is that, when one looks at utopian movements or radical attempts to change economic and political structures over the last couple of centuries, we don't need to be told how those ended. And this is often used as a stick to beat people with. And I think that's why actually there is a case for going to the academy, because we don't have to confine our thinking about social change to those last, to our grandparents and our great-grandparents and their parents' generation. We have a broader canvas now. If we can break it open, we can look at thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, to question the premises upon which those movements were founded, which were often made of sand. Primitive communism, the idea that we are innately this or innately that there is a kernel of egalitarianism, like an inner hunter-gatherer, if only we could figure out how to release it. These are powerful ideas, which people have died and been killed over. And I think the only way to interrogate them is through research, actually. So I would both defend and attack the academy on its record over this point. But it's your decision. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eric Opperly. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in Assyriology. I wanted to first observe that one of the things that surprised me when I first opened your book was that it was a history of social and political inequality rather than economic inequality, and just how little there is really devoted to discussions of economics and economic anthropology. But I wanted to highlight two particular concepts which you develop in the course of the book, which I thought might be interesting to ask the whole panel essentially what their reactions were, and whether you think that these particular narratives will stand the test of time. The first is your rather peculiar definition of slavery as a form of friendlessness, which I thought was very interesting, but also struck me as something totally alien from the perspective of an Assyriologist, in that, slavery in early Babylonian society, slaves could have families, they could have social relationships, and so you usually within the narrow confines of our Assyriological field, slavery is instead defined in terms of alienability, whether or not the slave can be bought and sold. So there's that concept, and the other concept which you developed, which I found very interesting, was that of the sacral nature of property, that property has a sort of a basis in ritual. So I wanted to ask the panelists, essentially, do we buy these views? And also, if not, what alternatives you would offer?
If I may, just briefly, we can't take credit for that observation about the institution of slavery, which really comes from the work of Orlando Patterson, the Jamaican sociologist, in his book Slavery and Social Death. Social death, yeah. Friendlessness, if you like.
I can respond to that definitely because I study slavery, at least here in the Americas. I push back against that a little bit, like this, because social death, how am I trying to put this? So enslaved people had they had different identities, I guess, different ways you were in different positions in society. So you might be different with your family or perhaps you do have friends, but the goal of slavery really is oftentimes, at least chattel slavery, is to sentence you to social death, wherein you are only property. So in that way, it's correct. I think it's just you have to be a bit more nuanced on whose perspective you are taking. Like it's trying to sentence someone to social death, that doesn't mean it's going to succeed. Like if you have read the work of Saidiya Hartman, like Venus in Two Acts, I would highly recommend.
A seriological point.
Sure. I mean, to me, it depends more on how we actually define the word slavery. We use it to oftentimes describe wildly different social conditions, and chattel slavery is really one of those extremes, I would say, on this long perspective of how people have been talking about slavery. I come from a family where people were enslaved until about 100 years ago under the Ottoman Empire. But it's a very different kind of slavery than the one that was experienced here on this continent, right? So I think it's really just that. It's a question of how you define your word, and in this case also translate a term into an English one, which comes with an enormous position of baggage, so to say, of historical fact.
I mean, I think if you think about North America, I've sort of always suggested this is like the most diverse, enslaved, unfree continent, right, in the history of the world. Right, if we start with indigenous slavery, and this is part of, I think, the argument that we found in the book is the multiplicity and the diversity and the unevenness of these experiences. And you can run, as for example, you do with sort of California, Pacific, that sort of comparative thing. You can run across the continent and find this range of unfreedoms to which we apply the word slavery, oftentimes not particularly usefully, that run from sort of, spiritual thing. There's moments where, to enslave someone is to tame them and domesticate them like a dog. So slave is called the dog, not as a representation of a social status, but of the act of taming and domestication and the stealing of power from that person. Well, that's a pretty interesting way that is pretty far from chattel slavery, right? Or sort of debt slavery, or temporary forms of enslavement that you would pass in and out of. And so if you take that whole range of diversity around sort of indigenous North America, throw into that the multiple and complicated, diverse forms of colonial slavery, imagine the hybrid forms that emerge out of that, right? I mean, what we're talking about is, in fact, one of these kind of multiple sort of landscapes, which too often, I think, has, been in popular discourse, at least, digested down to sort of chattel slavery in the South, right, or social death, when in fact there's this bigger kind of universe to examine.
I just wanted to just continue that thought slightly. The book finishes with the story of Franz Steiner, whose great unfinished work was precisely an attempt to unravel and disentangle the differences between what he called pre-servile institutions and the different gradations of power relations and so on. Sorry, I throw that in.
I mean, one reason why I brought this up is just that, both this definition of slavery that you're using throughout the book, and also of property, they're inherently social, right, and political, rather than emphasizing the economic aspects. So, of course, as Gojko brought up, and several of the other panelists have mentioned, it is a matter of definitions, but you've explicitly chosen to focus on the social and political sides of these issues and left the economic.
That's right. It's a very conscious decision to do that. And if you want to understand the roots of it, you can do no better, I think, than look at the work of the also recently departed mentor of my co-author, the great Marshall Sahlins, who devoted much of his career to the demolition of what he called Homo economicus, this phantasm that has taken over everything. We are certainly in that tradition and make no apology for it.
It seems to me that one of the spirits of the book is to say that, yes, economic inequality is not good, but it really bites when it's accompanied with political inequality.
And loss of freedom.
The loss of freedom. So it's not to de-emphasize economic inequality, is to say you need to understand it in its context, which includes the loss of these freedoms, which is the inequalities that really hover over our book.
Hi there, I'm Matt Liebman. I'm a professor in anthropology, but I received a question from the ether from somebody watching on Zoom. This is from Chloe Chapin, who's a G6 in American Studies. And so she emailed to ask, or to state first and then ask. The book offers a gloriously radical feminist critique of the field of archaeology, but stops short at questioning the masculinist frameworks that guide their central questions. Human systems and experiences that they call the state, political systems, philosophy, intellectualism, etc., are referred to as human experiences, when in reality they are experiences mostly of men. If Ask Better Questions is a gauntlet thrown, how can we ask new questions about social inequality that do not still center the lives, politics, intellectual interests, or even creativity and playfulness of men? What disciplinary boundaries need to shift for scholars to find a truly egalitarian view of what or who is allowed to count as humanity in the questions we bring to the human past? And you should direct your answers to the camera, not to me.
Does she have a dissertation topic yet?
Yeah.
She has an extraordinary dissertation.
That's then good.
I'm wondering what app she's using, because that would exceed the limit of anything I could. Oh, email. Okay, right. Hello. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a really serious problem, and it's a particular problem with using the ethno-historical sources. For example, those parts of the book where we attempt our reconstruction of what went on the West Coast in the historical lands of the Tolowa and the Yurok and the Miwok and so on. Historians have a very difficult call to make there. Do we make use of all this material generated by the American Ethnographic Bureau and Graeber and his students and so on, which was undoubtedly completely skewed to the experiences of men, right? I believe, it was quite unusual to even be able to talk to women or even attempt to talk to women about their experiences. So do we try to use this biased and skewed record? Do we abandon it altogether and just say it's useless? I guess the decision that we arrived at is that one should use it. Perhaps we don't use it critically enough, I think, is the implication of the question. And I think it's a fair criticism. It's a fair cop. Well, David used to refer to the ethnographic record as anthropologists' dirty little secret. And I think those are quite personal issues and decisions that scholars have to struggle with. But I think the short answer is we can't go back and do those things differently. We need new studies, I guess, new data.
I think the idea that
I would just say that's exactly it in my view, that these studies can be done and the evidence is there throughout history, and most of the societies most of us study are not, binary, multiplicities of genders, multiplicities of life forms, but those studies haven't been done, and of course this book in particular engages what has been done so far. So I think what you do, which I found very interesting and compelling, is you sort of resurrect Maria Gibutas. And that whole sort of discussion, which is another one of these dead by the wayside type debates that came out of the 50s, and which sort of transitioned into modern religion and Druidicism and things like that, but disappeared out of academia for reasons I do not quite understand.
Yeah.
But that is something that is waiting there to be picked up by dissertation topics.
I have a student right now working on this. You'll hear a lot about her in about 3 years.
I think this note on which we are ending here, which is that there's lots more productive things to be done, is the ideal note to end this, because the book itself is an opening and there's lots of things to do. I wanted to thank all of you in the audience for coming. I especially wanted to thank our guests, and thanks to Chloe in particular for reminding us about our live stream audience. And I hope this event has been audible and enjoyable for all of you. To our panelists, our sponsors, my colleague Rowan, this has just been a joy to organize. I'm so happy. And one final note, this is Inequality of Power. I'm going to volunteer all of our panelists to you for your follow-up questions. I didn't ask your permission in advance, but this can take place over the reception that we are having right now. It'll take us a couple of minutes to set up the reception, but all are welcome to stay and join us for more conversation. But in closing then, join me in thanking all of our speakers, David and Sue, who flew in from a distance, our colleagues, Asia, Phil, Gojko, for joining this panel, and to you for this event. Thank you.